The passage we read this morning from Exodus sounds like something out of fantasy literature. Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days with God. He has received the Ten Commandments, and now he's come down off the mountain. And initially, he doesn't seem to be aware of what other people can see, that his face is glowing. It's giving off rays of light. And these rays are so brilliant that the people cover his face with a cloth, so that whenever he speaks and addresses them with the message that God has given them, he takes off the cloth so they can see his glowing face, but otherwise it's covered up. It has all of the things that fantasy literature has: special effects, interactions with the divine, cultic practices. It's an amazing story. You can decide if this makes the story more miraculous or anticlimactic. When we've read through the book of Exodus, we see by the time we get to this point that this isn't the first time these events have happened. God has already given the Ten Commandments to Moses once. This is a repeat of all of that. You'll remember, if you've read through Exodus, that the first time God gives the Ten Commandments to Moses, he's on top of Mount Sinai. The smoke and the lightning and fire are surrounding the top of the mountain. And towards the end of that time period, God says to Moses, you need to go down and see what your people have done. They have grown impatient, waiting for your return. And they have fashioned a golden calf, and they are worshiping that instead of me. And Moses pleads with God to have mercy on his people and to not completely destroy them. But when Moses comes down off the mountain, he is so outraged with what he sees. He has taken the Ten Commandments and he smashes them on the ground. And it's the pieces of those that go in the Ark of the Covenant. So what we read about in the passage today from chapter 34 is the second time the Ten Commandments were given to Moses. And he comes down off the mountain with his face in glowing divine brilliance. It's what we might refer to as a do-over. A do-over is when something doesn't work out quite the way we had hoped initially. So we go back and we do it again. That could be something as casual as playing a board game and the dice roll off the table. And somebody picks the dice up off the floor and hands it back to us and said, well, that's a do-over. Go ahead and roll and start your turn all over again. Or it might be something much more public and embarrassing. You remember a few years ago when they were going to announce one of the winners of the Academy Award. And the man and woman who were up front with the announcement opened the card. And the man who was looking at the card looked at it strangely as we review it in the video now, because he could see that the category that was listed was different from the one they were announcing the nominees for. But the other person who was announcing it, aware of the awkward silence, just looked at the name and enthusiastically read it out. And the actress who came up front came up to be confronted by the people from the accounting firm that were responsible for keeping the ballots in advance. She saw what had happened, and with great dignity, I thought she went to the mic and she looked out in the audience at the person that actually won and said, a mistake has been made. You have won. Come up here and receive your reward. Or remember poor Steve Harvey when he was hosting the Miss Universe pageant. And towards the end of the pageant, he announces the winner. And they begin the music and they put the crown on someone's head, and then they find out, no, this is the wrong person. And the last thing you see as that pageant ends is the crowd being taken off of a very emotional woman. And poor Steve Harvey standing there saying, it's on my card. I just read the name that is on my card. Do-overs. when things didn't quite work out the way we'd initially hoped to. God gives Moses the Ten Commandments. It will be the cornerstone of the law, something that will distinguish God's people, set them apart, and organize every facet of their lives. But when they get impatient waiting for Moses to come off the mountain, and they return to something that's more familiar, the images of Baal, where the bull was a popular symbol of the deity, and they decide to do that instead, they meet with God's wrath and also with the wrath of Moses. But there's a do-over. Moses is called back up on the mountains, and here the Ten Commandments are presented again. This Wednesday, we will begin the season of Lent, a season of personal and communal reflection, where we look at ourselves and check in with our relationship with God and see how things are going on. It's a time of 40 days, not including Sundays, where we get to observe a do-over, looking deep into ourselves and examining who we are and deciding who it is that God expects us to be. Traditionally, it's a time for contemplating our mortality, contemplating what we're going to do with the time we've been given on earth. In the words of the old country song lyric, to decide if there's something better doing, we'd be doing if we could. It's also a time to examine our sinfulness, those things that we have held on to in place of worshiping God. Our form of idolatry isn't as blatant as what the Hebrews did in the Exodus passage with the golden calf. But there are many times in our lives when we put other things that we control, things that we can manipulate at the center focus of our life, rather than trusting in a God who transcends space and time. And it's also a time for just evaluating our Christian witness and ministry. A time when we realize that because we are Christian, we think that what we're doing must be right. Or because we are doing it for the church or in the name of God, surely God will bless it. Lent is a time for evaluation of that, for checking in, for what the John epistles in the New Testament refer to as testing the spirits. The Christian life, I believe, must always involve this kind of analysis through prayer, through reading Scripture, through communal worship, through listening to the stories and testimonies of one another. We should never get so fixed on what we're doing, even if we're doing it for God, that we don't stop periodically and check in with ourselves. God, is this truly what you mean for me and for my church at this particular time period? Lent, in this sense, isn't just something that are days on the calendar, but it's a practice of the Christian life, a time of inward reflection, of confession, and of repentance. As we approach the 40 days of Lent, this gives us the opportunity, as individuals, as a church, and as a denomination, to look deep within ourselves and to consider if we need a do-over. This fantastic story that we have from Exodus says something about the nature of the God that we worship and serve. We do serve a God of law and justice, but equally important, we serve a God of love and mercy. Amen.